Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with another Big Fat Eyeshadow Project update. That is a mouthful still, even though I've been doing it for most of the year. But I'm gonna update that project today, and we do have quite a few palettes to talk about. I have realized that I need to speed up a little bit if I want to complete all my palettes this year. But I'm gonna talk you through that when I go and introduce the new palettes, and also talk you through what I worked on in the past month. So I'm really excited to share with you the looks and everything like that, and the ratings for the palette, but also the other parts of the video, which is inspired by a couple other people. So first up we have the eyeshadow bank, which is inspired by Lara Force. She is doing like an eyeshadow bank where she has to earn points in order to buy palettes, and I'm doing the same this year. So there's a couple of different ways you can earn points, but for example it's for uses, hitting pan and finishing eyeshadows. That's just a couple of the ways. And yeah, I'm going to talk you through where I'm standing with that today. I also have the Expand Those Pans, which was created by Dora, which I haven't started including in my palette. So whenever I am working on a palette in this project that has a pan or more than one pan, I do pick one pan per palette to reach for 5 times. So those are like the main parts of this video. That is the main things I'm going to go through. But before I jump into the first part, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So I always start off with the eyeshadow bank, so I'm going to do that in this video too. It just makes sense to me to do that first and then move into the palette. So let's talk you through that. So like I said, there's a couple different ways to earn points. The first one is no pan left behind. So whenever I reach for a palette, no pan left behind, I get 1 point, and that is obviously only the first time I reach for the palette, no pan left behind. So I can only get 1 point per palette in my collection for this. And I actually have 6 palettes this month where I reached no pan left behind. The first one is my Natasha Nana Yucca palette, which was in this project last month, but I had a couple of shades left to reach for, so that is the first one. Then we have Nabla Dreamy, which is another one that is like what that was in this project last month, and same thing there. I had a couple of shades left to reach for, so that one is also completed now. We have the Anastasia Sultry palette, which I wrote in for my Level Up. So that one I have also reached no pan left behind on, which is a little bit of a spoiler there, but I have reached that goal. Then we have the Natasha Nana Mini Beber palette, which is in this project this month. And we also have the Natasha Nana Beber palette, the full-size one, which I also have in this project this month. And then lastly, Pat McGrath Divine Rose 2, which is also in this project for this month. So those are all the palettes that I reached no pan left behind on, which totals 6 points. Then we have quite a few points for uses. So first up we have 10 uses. So anytime I reach a 10 uses threshold, I get 1 point. And again, I have quite a few points here. I actually have 24, which is a lot. Let's talk through them. First up, we have my Anastasia Soft Glam palette. I have a couple shades in there. First up, we have Burnt Orange, which I have used 20 times for a total of 90, so 2 points. Then we have the shade Cypress Umber from the same palette. I have reached for that 10 times for a total of 40 in the year. Then the third shade we have to talk about is the Pat McGrath Utopian Dream shadow in Astral Venusian Orchid, which I have reached for 10 times, so that is the next shade. Then we have the Colourpop Amaze Super Shock Shadow, which I have actually finished now, which you will see soon. But that was in my yellow project pan, and I reached for that one 20 additional times for a total of 70. So that one is also 2 more points. Then we have my Burberry eyeshadow in Rosewood, which is the one I'm using in my eyebrows. I'm using that today as well, and I reached for that one 40 times, or like past the 40 kind of threshold, for a total of 310 uses in the year, which is really, really high. Super happy with that number. Then we have the Glam Shop Single and Turbo Mielka, which is also in my yellow project pan. I reached for that one for 30 times for a total of 80, so again, quite a few points there. Then we have the shade Pearl from the Anastasia Sultry palette. I reached for that one 10 times for a total of 10. Then we also have the Sydney Gray Single Shadow in Geese Alain. I also reached for that one 10 times for a total of 10 in the year. And then the rest of the shades are all from my Soft Glam palette. First up, we have the shade Orange Soda, which I reached for 10 times for a total of 60. We have the shade Bronze, which I reached for 20 times for a total of 50. Then we have the shade Sienna, which I reached for 10 times for a total of 90 in the year. And lastly, the shade Glistening, which I had 50 uses on for a total of 110 throughout the year. And that one, I didn't actually use 50 times this past month, but I did reach for it quite a lot in the past month. The reason why it's so high is because I had that one in a Franken highlighter, and I don't carry over the uses until that is done. So that is why the usage is so high on that one, but quite a few points there. And again, all of that equals up to 24 points. Then we actually have two shades which are in the 100 uses threshold. And whenever I reach 100 use threshold, I get 5 points. And since I have 2, I have 10 points total for this category. The first one is my Burberry Rosewood eyeshadow again. I reached for that one, like I reached past the 100 threshold for a total of 300 in the year. So that is 5 points. And then we also have that glistening shadow from my Soft Glam palette, which I have reached 400 times total in the year. So that is another 5 points, so 10 points in that category. We have one pan that I hit in the month of October, and that was in the shade Pearl in my Sultry palette. That is 1 point. And then lastly, we have finished shadows. And for finished shadows, again, I get 5 points if I finish a shadow. And I finished 2 shadows in the past month, which I'm really, really happy with. The first one was the shade Amaze, which was a Super Shock shadow from Colourpop. And then the second one was that shade Glistening from my Soft Glam palette. So 10 points in that category. So this is actually my highest month so far with points. I have far exceeded like my points so far in the year, so I'm really, really happy with that, because I was actually quite a lot in the negative for like the beginning of this month. I was standing at a negative 170, and the only reason I can get into the negative is if I'm gifted something. So if I purchase something myself, I can't get into the negative, but if I'm gifted something, I'm allowed to go into the negative. But I do want to finish up at like 0 points minimum at the end of the year, but we'll talk about that later on in this project. So mine is 170, but in the past month I was able to get in 51 points, which is a lot. So that corresponds to like 5 shadows. So if you are new to this project, every 10 points equal 1 shadow. So that's how I'm calculating it. So yeah, 51 points is really, really good, and I'm now standing at a negative 119, which is still a lot, but it gives me hope that I can get close to 0 by the end of the year. And then the rest of the points I'll probably get in by decluttering, I think. So that is why I'm standing with my eyeshadow bank today. I'm decently happy with it. Of course, I'm still in the negative, but I'm okay with that number. Okay, so that is the first part of the video. Let's go into the main part next, which is the Big Fat Eyeshadow Project usage part. So we're going to talk through the palettes that I was working on. The first palette that I have is my Project Level Up palette, which is the Sultry palette. I'm of course not going to show you what it looks like on the inside, but I can roll some footage of what it looked like early in the year, just for the reference. But this is a beautiful kind of neutral chrome palette. I hadn't used this one at all in the year so far. So I'm excited to work on it in that project, but also in this project, and create 3 exclusive looks with the palette. So yeah, I'm going to talk you through those 3 looks now. So we're going to start off with the first look, which I started off with the shade Twig, which is quite a cool tone crease shade, and I used that one in my crease as well as on my lower lash line for a base. Then for my lid, I went in with the shade Cinder all over my lid, and then I went in with Pearl on the inner corner and slightly into the inner lid. I wanted to make more of a kind of light look here. And then to add a little bit of depth, I added in the shade Dystopian, which is a really, really deep brown, and eyeshadow liner. And lastly, I used the shade Fresh used to blend everything out, and that was look number 1. It was really, like I said, light, beautiful kind of ethereal look, but I really, really like how it turned out. For day number 2, I wanted to do something quite different, so I wanted to dip into the shade Bloom in the palette, and I started off with that shade in my outer corner, as well as my outer crease and my lower lash line, like my outer lower lash line, for that kind of pop of that coral shade. Then I went into the shade Slate, which is the grey matte in the palette, and I went in with that in my inner crease. I then took the shade Cyborg, which is the like silver shimmer in the palette, and I put that one in my inner 2/3 of my lid. And then for my inner corner, I took the shade Pearl again, just to brighten up that area, and the shade Fresh again to blend everything out, and that was look number 2. Very, very different from the first one, but I'm happy with how that one turned out as well. And then for the very final look, we started off with the shade Birch, and I put that one in my crease and my lower lash line again, which is the more kind of neutral to warm leaning crease shade in the palette. And then I took the shade Teak, which is a really nice kind of bronzy shimmer on my outer corner. I went in with Rose Quartz all over the lid, and to kind of just deepen up my lashes a little bit, I went in with Noir, which is that black shade in the palette, and I went with that along the lash line. And then, as in every single look before that, I went in with the shade Fresh to blend everything out, and the shade Pearl on my inner corner, and that was the third and final look done. So that is all my 3 looks with this palette. So that is it for the looks. I'm going to go ahead and talk you through my ratings next. So for this palette, I rated it 3 for color story. I said this color story is pretty basic. It's a beautiful cool tone palette, and it's well thought out, but it's not very creative. I do enjoy it, but it falls in the middle as a good but kind of boring color story. So 3 points. Then for versatility, I also gave it a 3. I said despite being a cool tone palette, you can create some more neutral to warm leaning looks, and Bloom creates a way to make more colorful and unique looks as well. However, it's mostly going to lean cool to neutral. So 3 points. For quality, I gave it a 4. I said I really like the quality of this palette. Is it the best in my collection? No, but I really think it works beautifully. The shimmers are pretty impactful for such a mainstream palette, but of course there is room for improvement, so 4 points. And then for personal ranking, I also gave it a 4. I said I really like this palette and it's one of my favorite options for cool tones. I enjoyed the looks that I made with it, and I think the undertone suits me quite well. So it's definitely one to score quite high for me, even if it's not a top palette. So 4 points there. And adding everything together, this one scored in at 14 out of 20 points. So there we have the first palette. Let's move into palette number 2, which is my Beauty Bay Wilderness palette. So yeah, the Beauty Bay Wilderness palette is right here. I'm going to, of course, roll the footage again, what it looks like. It's a beautiful kind of, I always say like a grungier rainbow palette. It has a lot of different undertones. It has those kind of rusty, kind of sunset type of shades at the bottom, but then it also has some brighter blue and greens in it too. It is very, very versatile. It's very autumnal to me, even though it is a bit brighter, and I really do enjoy this palette quite a lot. So let's jump into the looks. So for the first look, I actually did a palette bingo with this palette, and I started off with the shade Twilight on my outer corner, which is the really deep navy shade, and then I took the shade Eucalyptus on my crease and my lower lash line, which is the deep green kind of on the center, like bottom, like the third row basically. And so yeah, I blended all of those together, and then for the shimmers, I went in with the shade Moss on my center lid, and then the shade Lime on my inner lid. Then for my kind of inner corner area, I went in with the shade Fossil on my inner lower lash line. And for my actual inner corner, I went in with the shade Ray, which is the center shade on the top row, and that was my inner corner highlight, and that was look number 1. I'm really, really happy with how this turned out, especially for being a palette bingo. Then for look number 2, I don't feel like I like how this one looked on camera, but I did like how it looked in real life. We started off with the shade Raw on my outer corner, which is the red shade in the palette, and I blended that out with the shade Poppy in my kind of outer crease and outer lid, which is the more bright red. Then I took the shade Sunrise on my inner crease, which is the orange shade in the palette, and the shade Marigold I also put in my inner crease kind of to blend that out, which is the more kind of yellowy tone shade. Then on my kind of upper crease in the very center, I took the shade Leaf, which is the kind of more bright green on the third row, and I took that, like I said, on my upper lid, just kind of blending it above those other shades, as well as on my lower lash line. And then for the shimmers, I took the shade Heat, which is that red shimmer on the bottom row, all over my lid, and then I ended up blending everything out with the shade Snow, which is the first shade in the palette. And then to brighten everything up, I took the shade Ray, which again is that shade on the top row, and I put that on my inner lid, my inner corner, as well as on my inner lower lash line, and that was the second look done. For day number 3, I wanted to do a bit of a more simple look, but also still colorful, and I'm really happy again how this one turned out. I started off with the shade Ivy, and I put that on my outer corner, which is the deepest shade on the second row. And then I took the shade Forest, which is the first shade on the second row, and I put that in my outer crease as well, just kind of like to blend out Ivy. Then I took the shade Mint, which is the center shade on the second row, and I put that in my inner crease as well as all over the lid as a base. And I really like this shade. I wanted it to be like the focus of the look because I really like the undertone of it. And then to kind of give some shimmer to it, to the look, I put the shade Ray, again on the first row, on my center lid as a topper, as well as on my inner corner, and that was the third look done. Again, a bit of an easier one, but I really like how it turned out nevertheless. So that is all of the looks that I did. The palette now looks like this, and I'm going to talk you through the uses of this palette so far. I have reached for Snow once, Sky I haven't reached for, Ray I have reached for 5 times, and that one was my Expand Those pan. And you can see that the pan has definitely expanded. The pan was barely showing in my kind of introduction of this palette, which is why I wanted to work on Ray, because yeah, I wanted it to be a visible pan, and it definitely is now. Then we have Twilight, which I used once, Ocean I haven't reached for, Forest I reached for once, Breeze next to it I didn't reach for, and then the last 3 shades on that row I reached for 1 time each. For the rest of the palette I reached for everything once apart from this shade right here called Earth, which I have not reached for. So the ones that I have not yet reached is for Earth. We have Ocean and then Sky. Oh, and Breeze as well. So a couple of shades that I haven't reached for, but I was sure to do No Pan Left Behind on this palette in the month of November, just to get that completed. So let's move on to the ratings on this palette next. We're going to start off with Color Story, and I gave it a 4. I said, this is a really fun color story. It has grungy tones, but it's still bright, almost like an autumn rainbow palette. There's also a few options for more neutral shades, and it's a palette with really unique and inspiring color story. So 4 there. Versatility, I gave it a 4. I said you can create warm-toned, cool tones, colorful and neutral looks, but you can also build depth and make more ethereal looks too. The only thing missing is purely neutrals, as the neutral tones in here has kind of more slight colorful undertones, like either like green leaning or orange leaning, so 4 there. For quality, I also gave it a 4, and I said the shimmers in here are so good. They're super sparkly, buildable and dimensional. The mattes are good, but they're not perfect, and they can be hard to build on top of each other. So start with the darkest and don't layer too much, so 4 there. Then for personal ranking, I also gave it a 4, and I said I do like this palette and I think it's a lot of fun to play with. I almost gave it a 3, but the only reason I was gonna is because I'm into more subtle and neutral looks at the moment. However, I know that my preference will change, and then this will definitely be back to a 4, so that is why I gave it a 4. And adding that together, because it's 4 times 4, which means that this palette scored in at 16 out of 20 points. So that is my Wilderness palette. The third palette that we have to talk about is this one right here, which is my Pat McGrath Divine Rose 2 palette, which looks like this. I'm going to roll the footage as well, what it looks like. This is a really, really beautiful color story. It was the Pat McGrath palette that I felt like was my least favorite. So yeah, I wasn't like as excited to reach for this one as some of my other Pat McGrath palettes, but I need to reach for it at some point, so I decided to pull it in the month of October. So let me talk you through the 3 looks that I made with this palette. So for day number 1, I started off with the shade Naked Blush, and I put that in my crease as well as my lower lash line, which is that kind of peachier crease shade, and then I took the shade Bronze Rose 005 all over my lid. And then lastly, I took the shade Astral Pink Moon as an inner lid topper, as well as on my inner corner. And that is it. I just did those 3 shades, but I really like how this look turned out. So for day number 2, I wanted to do more of a colorful look, and I wanted to dip into that pink shade in the palette. So I started off with that shade, which is called Rose Seduction, all over my crease, as well as on my inner and outer corner, as well as on my lower lash line. So quite a lot of that shade. And then I went in with the shade Extreme Burgundy, which is the deepest shade in the palette, and I put that on my outer corner just to deepen it up a tiny bit. For the center of the lid, I went in with the shade Gold Lust 001, which is the gold shade on the top row, and I just put that on the center lid like I said. And then to finish up the look, I went in with the shade Skin Show Rose Opal on my inner corner, which is the first shade in the palette, and that was look number 2. Really like how this one turned out. I got quite a few compliments on this one. It was in my deco panning update, I believe. So yeah, that was look number 2. For day 3, I started off with the shade Naked Blush again, which is that kind of peachy crease shade, and I put that in my crease as well as on my lower lash line. Then I went in with Extreme Burgundy on my outer corner just to deepen it up a tiny bit, which is again the deepest shade in the palette. For my outer lid, I went in with the shade Divine Dusk. And then all over my lid, I went in with the shade Eleganza, again all over the lid. And then for my inner corner, I went in with the shade Skin Show Rose Opal again. And this one was a more kind of, again, neutral leaning look. But I really, really like how this one turned out as well. So yeah, that was my 3 looks. Quite easy looks. There's only 10 shades in the palette, and I didn't want to complicate it too much, but I really like how all 3 looks turned out. And I did use this palette quite a bit. Let me talk you through what I used. So I did use the shade Skin Show Rose Opal twice. Same with Naked Blush twice. Eleganza I used once. I used Bronze Rose 005 once, as well as Gold Lust 001 I also used once. Extreme Burgundy I used twice, I used Divine Dusk once, then I used Rose Seduction once. This shade here, which are VR Extraterrestrial, I did not use in the week that I had this palette as my focus, but I did use it afterwards to complete enough left behind, so I reached for that one once. And then Astral Pink Moon I also reached for once. So I did have, again, no pan left behind on this palette. And since there's no pans in this palette, I did not do expand those pans with this specific one. So again, let's go through the ratings. For Color Story, I gave it a 4. I said, this is a Pat McGrath Color Story after all. It isn't my favorite one from her, but it's still a very unique and the shades work really well together. You can layer shades to create numerous combinations, and even with only 2 mattes, you have a lot of options. So 4 for Color Story. Versatility, I gave it a 3. I said this for me seems like quite a monotone palette, but there is actually quite a lot of versatility. The lightest matte is more of a kind of peachy color that you can lean more warm when paired with the golds, and more pinky when paired with the rosier tones in the palette. You have depth, iridescent shades, sparkles, satins, but there is room for more colorful looks as well as easy neutral looks. The only caveat is that the palette mainly creates rosy or gold bronze looks, and there's not much else, so 3 for that. And then for quality, I gave it a 4. I said Pat McGrath has some of the best quality out there, and this palette is so easy to work with. The mattes blend with 0 effort, and the shimmers are impactful, either with or without sparkles. My only flaw is that I wish there was more special shades in this palette that had like that kind of textural sparkle finish. A lot of them are more like kind of like fine special like kind of formula. I prefer like the sparkled special formula from her, but that again is a preference, so 4 for quality. For personal ranking, I gave it a 5, which is very, very surprising. And I actually said, okay, so this comes as a shocker to me. I did not expect myself to rate this palette a 5. Listen, is this palette perfect? No, but I adored all the looks that I made with it. This is the Pat McGrath palette that I viewed as my least favorite, but I honestly loved the looks that I made. The palette looks very pink at first glance, but removing that bright pink kind of satin shade, it's really more like a peachy neutral palette with some warm mauves and bronzes. Again, I could have taken a few more sparkly shades, but I really enjoyed my time with this palette, and I felt really pretty in all 3 looks. So 5 there, which again was shocking. And that means that this palette scored in at 16 out of 20 points, which was palette number 3. So we actually have 2 more palettes to go. I did actually go to do 1 more extra palette this month, just because again I want to catch up. So let's go ahead and talk you through those. The first one is my Natasha Denona Beber palette, which is a beautiful kind of neutral palette. It has 3 kind of distinct rows. The first row is more kind of a camely undertone. The second row is more kind of like, I don't know, it has like a more of a peachy undertone, but it's a very, very unique undertone. I really like that row. And then the last row is kind of more like a cool toned row. But yeah, really like this whole palette. So let me talk you through the 3 looks. So for the first look, I wanted to dip into like those kind of cool tone shades in the palette, and I started off with the shade Dusk as my first transition, which is the last shade in the palette. Then I went in with the shade Sculpture, which is the grey matte, like the grey matte on the center in the bottom row, and I put that one on my crease as well as on my lower lash line. I really like this kind of undertone. Then I took the shade next to it called Tour on my outer corner, outer crease, and my lower lash line blend. So that was that shade. And then for my shimmer, I went in with the shade Monroe, which is the lightest out of the 3 shimmers, and I put that on the inner 2/3 of my lid, as well as on my inner corner, and that was look number 1. I really like this undertone. I don't usually go for cool tone looks, but I think this one really suited me, so very, very happy with that look. Then for day number 2, I started off with the shade Tone on my crease and lower lash line, which is the last shade on the second row. And then I took the shade Buff right next to it on my outer lid to deepen it up a little bit. And I took both Rayon and Pasha on my outer corner. Pasha is a little bit deeper, so I took that one first and then blended that with Rayon. And then as a liner, I used the shade Spot, which is the black in the palette. For my inner lid, I used the shade Shine, which is the last shimmer on the top row. And then on my inner corner, I used the shade Monroe again, which is that lightest shimmer. And that was look number 2. For day number 3, I started off with the shade Freckle on my outer crease. So this is on the top row, and this is kind of the row that I focus on mainly for the third look. And then I took the shade Prairie on my inner crease, which is the second shade in the palette. For my outer corner, I went in with the shade Cocoa, which is also on the first row. And then all over the lid, I went in with the shade Rustic, which is that deepest shimmer in the palette, which is the first shade also in the palette. And then to lighten up the inner corner, I went in with the shade Monroe again. And that was the last look. Again, a bit more of a simple look, but I really, really like how this one turned out. So those were all of the 3 looks. Of course, with this palette, you make mainly like neutral tone palettes or neutral toned looks. But yeah, really, really happy with all 3 looks. So let me talk you through the usage. So I did actually end up using this whole palette, no plan left behind, but I'll talk you through the usage. The first row, I used the whole first row 1 time each. For the second row, I used Pasha twice, Monroe 3 times, Rayon, Buff, and Tone, which were twice each. Seed, I actually didn't use in the week that I had it, but I have reached for that one afterwards. Then Tour, Sculpture, Spot, and Dusk, I reached for 1 time each. And that is this palette finished. Again, no pans in here, so no Expandos pans for this one. So let me just talk you through the ranking of it instead. So for Color Story, I gave it a 4. I said at an initial glance, this feels like a boring old neutral palette. And yes, it is. However, it's so well made. It has lots of different undertones, depth, and formulas. It is a great everyday palette and a staple in my collection. So 4 for Color Story. Versatility, I gave it a 3. I said, like I mentioned, the palette has so many different undertones, which makes it quite versatile for a neutral palette. It has these unique kind of gray tones that really suit me. They're also relatively unique in my collection. Of course, you can't do any colorful looks really or anything like that. But for a neutral palette, it is very versatile still, so 3 for that category. And then for quality, I gave it a 5. I said, this here is that amazing raved about Natasha Denona quality. The mattes blend like an absolute dream. They build on top of each other. The shimmers are metallic and very usable. It was so easy making all 3 looks thanks to the quality. So of course, 5 there. And then for personal ranking, I gave it a 5 again. I said, I absolutely adore this palette. It is a staple in my collection. I actually enjoyed using it on its own a lot more than I thought. And I also know that I already love this one as a companion palette for my indie singles. If I had a smaller collection, this would be my main neutral palette that I would keep around. So 5 there, which means that this palette scored in at 17 out of 20 points. And then the final palette that we have to talk about is the sister palette to that, which is the mini Beber palette. And this one is a 5-hand palette. It's quite small, and yeah, I was excited to reach for this one because I haven't played around with it too much. And I thought I had my mind set up about this palette, but I actually changed my mind a little bit through it. But I'm going to talk you through that with the ratings later on. So let's start off with the 3 looks. So for day number 1, I started off with the shade Izzy on my crease and my lower lash line. And then I went in with the shade Wing on my outer corner. And then for the lid, I went in with the one and only shimmer in the palette, which is called Blaze Nude. And I put that all over my lid as well as on my inner corner. And that was the first look done. Very, very simple, very kind of easy everyday look. But yeah, really happy with how it turned out. For day number 2, I also made a very easy everyday kind of look, and I started off with the shade Plush in my crease and outer corner. And that was kind of the only shade that I used apart from the shimmer, which is again Blaze Nude, and I used that all over my lid and on my inner corner. So a very, very simple look with just 2 shadows, but I'm really, again, happy with how that look turned out. And then for the final look, I always, with these small like on a 5-pan palettes, I want to make a look with all 5 shades. So that's what I did for the last look. So I started off with the shade Bruno on my outer and inner corner, which is the first shade in the palette, which is also the deepest shade of the palette. And then I took the shade Wink to help blend out Bruno in the outer and inner corner, which is the last shade of the palette. I took the shade Izzy as my first crease shade and on my lower lash line, and then the shade Plush as my second crease and blending out shade. And then of course I used the shade Blaze Nude on my center lid and on my inner corner to create this beautiful halo eye, which I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. So yes, that is this palette right here. I'm really happy again with how it turned out, and I did enjoy this palette quite a bit. But yeah, for the uses, I used the shade Bruno once, Izzy twice, Blaze Nude I reached for 3 times, Plush I reached for twice, and Wink I also reached for twice. So that is the usage for this palette. For the ratings, for color story, I gave it a 3. I said this is quite a boring color story, if I'm being honest. Everything is very useful, but it really isn't the most inspired color story, which is why the looks mostly turned out kind of like every day. So 3 there. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, which is why I rated it a 3 and not lower. But yeah, nothing exciting, so 3. For versatility, I gave it a 2. I said again, this palette's created mostly every day, easy, like I don't have to think about it looks. There is of course depth within the palette, which makes it a bit more versatile, but overall I think I could not rank it higher than a 2. There's also only one shimmer, which limits the looks quite a bit as well. And then for quality, I gave it a 4. I said the quality in here is really good. The mattes blend super well and they work really nicely. The shimmer is very impactful and stunning. I have had some issues with hard pan on the final cream to powder shades though, so it isn't perfect, hence the 4. And then for personal ranking, I gave it a 4. I said, so I enjoy this palette a lot more than I thought. I thought that this was my least favorite mini palette from Natasha Denona, but I did actually enjoy all 3 looks quite a lot. The undertones in here works perfectly for me. They're a bit more peachy, which means it creates those kind of like soft romantic undertones, which I really like. And it's, again, I don't have to think about a type of palette. You know what, I actually looked at the rankings again, and considering what I ranked other things in the past, I think I'm going to change color story to 2, because even though it's very useful and very very nice every day, I don't think it is like a 3, because again it's very boring. So I'm going to change that to 2, which means that the rankings comes in at 12 out of 20 points for this palette. So that is going to be the main things of this video. The last things to do before I introduce you to the new palettes is talking about these 2 palettes right here. So these ones were in my Big Fat Eyeshadow project previously, and I did have these still in for Expand Those Pans, which is why I want to talk about them. First up, we have this palette right here, which is my Novel Dreaming palette, and I was working on the Inception right here for Expand Those Pans, and I believe I had reached for that one 3 times, I think twice or 3 times in the past update, but I'm happy to say that I have now reached for this one 5 times. I reached for it on my lower lash line quite a bit, so I'm not sure how much the pan has expanded, but I have reached that goal on this shade, which means that it can roll out. And then similarly with the Novena palette, again, I was working on the shade Volatile right here. Again, the pan is still quite small, but I use this one on my lower lash line again quite a lot. So I use very, very little amount, but I have reached my 5 use goal on this shade. So again, it will be rolling out. So that is going to be it for this update. Before I wrap it up, I'm just going to quickly introduce you to the new palettes that I'm rolling in for next month, to let you know what I'm going to work on in the next month. And I'm going to work on 5 palettes in this project actually, just because again, I need to catch up in order to finish the project. So 5 palettes in November, and the first one out of those is my Natasha Denona Mini Gold palette. This is a really beautiful, like green leaning neutral type of color story. I really like this one, and I reached for this one kind of a lot end of last year because it was my project level up level 5 palette. I'm excited to reach for it again, but that is going to be the first palette. The second palette is going to be another one of my Patmograph palettes, and this one is the Moonlit Seduction palette. This is a palette that I really haven't reached for very much in my collection. I got this one from my friend who decluttered it from her collection, or I bought it off her, and I'm really excited to play with this one. It's more of a kind of cool tone leaning Patmograph palette, so it's a bit more unique for her, and I'm excited to create looks with it. You also have that kind of new, more unique special shade formula, which again I'm going to be excited to try, especially because they're not like that kind of baked formula. But yeah, this one is going to be the second palette that I'm going to work on in the next month. We have this palette next, which is my Red Dragon palette from Odenside. This is a really beautiful, again, more neutral kind of color story. It's a very autumnal type of neutral palette. It has rustier undertones, it has those green undertones, and I'm excited to make 3 exclusive looks with this palette. I have gotten a decent amount of use out of this palette, especially because I have 3 pans in it. I think when the footage is happening, I might only have 1, because I took that footage at the beginning of the year, but it does now have 3 pans in it. And I'm excited to reach for this one to make like exclusive looks with it, because I'm not sure I've done that too much in the past. Then we have my Mountain Trail palette from Sydney Grace, which is again more of a green leaning palette. I'm pulling out most of these now because I feel like I want to reach for those shades a lot in October, November, which is why I'm pulling this palette in as well. It is a really beautiful, again, neutral type of palette, but it has like an olivey green undertone. I always loved this palette quite a bit, but I haven't been as into greens this year, so I'm excited to see how I feel about it now. Yeah, it has a lot of options for shimmers and mattes, and overall I think this is a really beautiful palette, so I'm excited to play with this one too. And then the last palette I'm really excited to play with, because this one I've had now for exactly like a year in my well, not quite yet, but when I'm going to use it, because this one is the Natasha Denona Glam Face Palette, which I got for my birthday last year, which is in November, on November 19th. This one has 5 shades in it and also 2 face shades. I'm not going to track the face shades, but I'm going to try to use them when I reach for the rest of the palette. But I'm really excited to reach for the shades in here because I haven't played around with this palette too much. And I also feel like the shimmers in here are very, very sparkly and beautiful. So I'm excited to try that formula out. So that is my Glam Face Palette. And then the last thing to do before I wrap up this video is to roll in a shade from Expandos Pans. We have these 3 to choose between. So I'm going to roll between 1 and 3. So this is going to be the first shade, second shade, and third shade. So let's see what I get. I hope I don't get like jade because I don't mind. We'll see what I get. Get 2. So 2 is... It is the shimmer shade, which is this one right here. I found that one this year, but I'm fine working on it again. So that is the shade Amber, and that is going to be my Expandos pan, which I have to reach for 5 times before the next update, or at least before this project wraps up. And that, you guys, is going to be it for this video. It's been quite a long one, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And otherwise, I hope you guys are having an amazing day as always, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye, guys.